A desperate man kidnaps what he thinks is just a rich kid to make a quick buck. But when he discovers the boy is the son of a ruthless cartel leader, every move becomes a fight for survival, and a shocking twist forces him to confront the cost of redemption. Carlos leaned against a rusted lamppost, his hood pulled low over his face as he scanned the crowded park. The chatter of children playing and the rhythmic creak of swings provided the perfect cover for his intentions. His eyes locked on Diego, a boy no older than 10, with dark, neatly combed hair and an air of wealth that practically screamed privilege. Carlos tightened his grip on the handle of his weathered duffel bag. This was the kid, quick, clean, and profitable. Diego was momentarily alone, crouched by the edge of the sandbox as he fiddled with a toy car. The opportunity was fleeting, and Carlos seized it. Approaching with casual confidence, he bent down as if he knew the boy. "Hey kid, your dad's waiting by the car. Let's go," he murmured, gesturing to the park's edge. Diego looked up, puzzled but obedient. "Where's Papa?" Carlos forced a smile. "Just over there. Come on." With Diego's small hand in his, Carlos moved swiftly, blending into the stream of pedestrians. His pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Minutes later, they were in the back seat of a beat-up sedan. The boys' confused questions were drowned out by the roar of the engine as Carlos sped away. In a dimly lit apartment across town, Carlos secured Diego to a chair with zip ties. The boy's quiet demeanor was unnerving. No tears, no screams, just wide, observant eyes. Carlos shook off the unease, grabbing his phone to draft a ransom demand. He typed quickly, crafting a message that made it clear this wasn't a game. But as he waited for a response, something on the television caught his attention. The news anchor's voice filled the room, urgent and grave. "Breaking news. Diego Valverde, son of Alejandro Valverde, has reportedly gone missing. Authorities believe he may have been abducted. Alejandro Valverde, known as the leader of one of the country's most powerful cartels, has issued a statement promising swift retribution against those responsible." Carlos froze, the blood draining from his face. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. This wasn't just a rich kid. This was his kid, the son of a man whose name inspired terror across the region. A man who had the resources, connections, and ruthlessness to hunt him down. Panic set in, tightening its grip around Carlos's chest. He paced the small room, raking his hands through his hair. This was supposed to be a straightforward job, a quick payout to keep him afloat. Now he was in over his head, tangled in the web of a cartel he had no hope of escaping. Diego shifted in his chair, watching Carlos with quiet intensity. "You're scared," the boy said softly, his voice steady despite his predicament. Carlos whipped around, his expression hardening. "Shut up." But the boy didn't flinch. "Papa will come for me," he added, his calm words laced with a confidence that sent chills down Carlos's spine. The realization hit like a freight train. He wasn't just running from a mistake, he was running from death itself. Carlos grabbed a duffel bag stuffed with essentials and hoisted it over his shoulder. He couldn't stay here, he had to move, and fast. Without another word, he grabbed Diego and ushered him out of the apartment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Every step felt like walking deeper into a trap, but there was no turning back now. Carlos had made a fatal mistake, and the clock was ticking dot. The streets of the city were alive with noise and movement as Carlos maneuvered his old sedan through side roads, constantly glancing at the rearview mirror. His fingers tapped nervously against the steering wheel. Diego sat silently in the back seat, his small hands fidgeting with the edges of his shirt. The boy's calmness was unnerving. Carlos knew he couldn't risk staying in the city. He needed to get out, put as much distance as possible between them and Alejandro's men. But every highway, every main road, was crawling with cartel enforcers. He had seen them, dark SUVs parked at intersections, men with sharp eyes scanning every passing car. Alejandro had unleashed his network, and there was no escaping its reach. Carlos turned sharply into an alley, his tires skidding on the wet pavement. He parked behind a row of dumpsters and killed the engine. For now, they needed to disappear. "Why are we stopping?" Diego asked, his voice steady but curious. Carlos shot him a warning look. "Quiet." The boy's expression didn't change, but his silence felt more deliberate than obedient. Carlos sighed and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had underestimated this entire situation, Alejandro's resources, the boy's strange composure, and most of all, his own desperation. Staying ahead of the cartel seemed impossible. Night began to fall, casting long shadows over the alley. Carlos decided to move again, hoping the cover of darkness would give him a chance to slip through the checkpoints. He chose back streets and narrow lanes, navigating the labyrinthine paths like a rat scurrying from predators. Diego remained quiet, though Carlos could feel the boy's eyes on him, watching, analyzing. After hours of driving, they reached the edge of the city, but just as Carlos thought he'd found a clear route out, his heart sank. A line of SUVs blocked the road ahead, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Men armed with rifles stood in the glow, their silhouettes unmistakable. Carlos cursed under his breath and reversed, his mind racing for an alternative. Every major exit would be the same, guarded, impenetrable. He turned off the road and onto a dirt path that wound through an industrial district. There, among warehouses and abandoned lots, he found a temporary refuge. The air smelled of rust and oil as Carlos parked behind an old shipping container. He reached into the duffel bag and pulled out a half-empty water bottle, offering it to Diego. The boy took it without a word, sipping carefully. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" Diego asked suddenly, his voice breaking the tense silence. Carlos hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No," he said finally. "I just need to figure this out." "Figure what out?" Diego pressed, his tone oddly mature. "You can't run from Papa." Carlos's jaw tightened. The kid wasn't wrong, but hearing it out loud made the weight of his predicament unbearable. He didn't respond, instead turning his attention to the map he had stolen from a gas station earlier. Every option felt like a dead end. As the night dragged on, Carlos realized the boy wasn't just a passive victim. Diego's resilience was unsettling. He wasn't crying, panicking, or begging. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, as if he knew something Carlos didn't. And that thought terrified him more than Alejandro's men. The sound of distant engines echoed through the empty industrial lot as Carlos sat hunched over the map. His thoughts tangled in frustration and fear. Diego rested against the cold metal wall of the warehouse, his small frame illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight. Despite his circumstances, the boy exuded a strange calmness that Carlos couldn't understand. Far across the city, Alejandro Valverde's empire was in motion. Streets were locked down, phone lines were tapped, and men were dispatched to every corner. Alejandro's fury was palpable, his focus singular. Find Diego. The cartel leader stood in his office, his hand gripping a tumbler of whiskey as he stared at a map marked with red pins. Each represented a possible location, but none provided answers fast enough. Carlos knew time was slipping away. He needed a plan, but each idea seemed worse than the last. "We'll head to the train yard," he muttered to himself, tracing a route with his finger. "Slip out on a freight train. Maybe—" "You're wasting time," Diego interrupted, his voice steady but soft. Carlos turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "You can't run," Diego said, his tone unwavering. "Papa will find you." Carlos slammed the map onto the floor. "You don't get it, do you? I'm trying to keep us alive." Diego didn't flinch. "If you wanted to keep me alive, you'd have left me. You're scared. For yourself." The words cut deeper than Carlos cared to admit. He looked away, unwilling to confront the truth in the boy's observation. The kid was sharp, too sharp for his age. And Carlos hated that Diego's calm demeanor made him feel even more powerless. Outside comma, the sound of footsteps crunched against gravel. Carlos snapped to attention, peering through a crack in the metal door. Shadows moved in the distance. 2, maybe 3 figures, their flashlights sweeping the area. Alejandro's men were getting closer. "Stay here," Carlos whispered, pulling a knife from his bag. Diego grabbed his arm. "They won't stop. Papa trained them." Carlos pulled free and stepped out into the darkness, his heart pounding. He crept between stacks of crates, avoiding the beams of light. The men were thorough, methodical, checking every hiding spot. Carlos held his breath, gripping the knife tighter as one of the flashlights swept dangerously close. From behind him, a soft sound. Carlos turned sharply, his stomach dropping as he saw Diego standing in the doorway. "What the?" he hissed, but it was too late. One of the men shouted, and the hunt was over. Carlos grabbed Diego, hauling him back into the warehouse as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. He dove behind a stack of pallets, shielding the boy as the gunfire grew louder. Diego's voice broke through the chaos, steady even in the face of danger. "You're not just running now," he said. "You're marked." Carlos didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew. The night was oppressive, the distant gunfire finally giving way to an eerie silence. Carlos and Diego crouched in the shadow of a crumbling construction site, surrounded by piles of concrete and rusted beams. It wasn't safety, but it was as close as they were going to get. Carlos leaned against a broken wall, catching his breath while keeping his ears sharp for any sounds of pursuit. Diego sat a few feet away, his knees drawn to his chest. The boy hadn't said a word since they'd escaped the warehouse, but his presence weighed heavily on Carlos. The kid wasn't just baggage, he was a liability, a walking target whose life now depended on Carlos's increasingly desperate decisions. "Why didn't you just leave me back there?" Diego finally asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Carlos glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "If I left you, they'd find you, and then they'd find me. It's easier this way." Diego tilted his head, his dark eyes studying Carlos. "You're lying." Carlos frowned. "Watch your mouth, kid." "I'm not stupid," Diego continued. "You didn't have to save me back there, but you did. You're scared, but not just for yourself." Carlos gritted his teeth. "Think what you want." The conversation ended as quickly as it started, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts. As much as he hated to admit it, the boy wasn't wrong. There had been a moment back at the warehouse when Carlos could have run. He could have let the cartel take Diego and disappeared, but some instinct he couldn't explain had kept him from doing it. Hours passed, and the cold night air settled into their bones. Diego shivered, and Carlos cursed under his breath, digging through his duffel bag. All he found was an old, thin blanket, which he tossed to the boy. "Thanks," Diego said, wrapping it around himself. A cough escaped his lips, faint but persistent. Carlos's head snapped toward him. "You sick or something?" Diego shook his head but didn't meet Carlos's eyes. "I'm fine." Carlos wasn't convinced. As the minutes ticked by, the cough grew worse, until Diego's breathing became shallow and ragged. Panic clawed at Carlos's chest. He knelt beside the boy, gripping his shoulders. "What's wrong?" Diego wheezed, struggling to speak. I need my inhaler." "Damn it," Carlos hissed, running a hand through his hair. The boy was asthmatic, and Carlos hadn't thought to check for medication when he grabbed him. Now, he had a sick kid in the middle of nowhere, and no idea how to help. Desperation pushed him to his feet. He paced the small space, cursing himself for every decision that had led to this moment. He couldn't let the boy die, not like this. He needed supplies, fast, but leaving meant risking exposure, and the cartel was still hunting them. Carlos knelt back down, his tone softer this time. "I'll fix this," he said, looking Diego in the eye. "You just need to hang on, okay?" Diego nodded weakly, his earlier resilience now overshadowed by his worsening condition. Carlos felt a pang of something unfamiliar, responsibility, maybe even guilt. For the first time, the boy wasn't just a bargaining chip or a mistake, he was a person, and Carlos couldn't shake the growing need to protect him. The night stretched long as Carlos carried Diego through the maze of darkened streets. The boy's shallow breathing and occasional gasps made every second feel heavier. Carlos's mind raced. There was only one person he could turn to, his sister, Lorena. She had always warned him about his reckless lifestyle, but she was the only one he trusted. Reaching Lorena's modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, Carlos hesitated. He knew coming here was a risk. She'd be furious, and if the cartel was watching her, he'd only put her in danger. But he didn't have a choice. He knocked softly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't followed. The door opened a crack, and Lorena's wary eyes appeared. Her expression darkened when she saw Carlos. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, pulling the door open wider. Carlos stepped inside, carrying Diego. "I need your help," he said quickly, his voice low but urgent. "The kid's sick. He needs an inhaler or something." Lorena's gaze shifted to Diego, who looked pale and fragile in Carlos's arms. Her anger softened, but only slightly. "Who is this? What did you do?" "I don't have time to explain," Carlos snapped. "Just help him." Lorena sighed and gestured for him to lay Diego on the couch. She rummaged through a cabinet, pulling out an old first aid kit and a few bottles of medication. "This won't fix him, but it might help for now," she said, handing Carlos an inhaler. Diego took a shaky puff, his breathing easing slightly. Carlos watched with relief as some color returned to the boy's cheeks. Lorena crossed her arms, her expression a mix of anger and concern. "Talk," she demanded. "What's going on?" Carlos hesitated. I messed up. I grabbed the wrong kid. He's Alejandro Valverde's son. Lorena's face drained of color. You kidnapped the son of that Alejandro Valverde? Are you insane? Do you think I don't know that? Carlos shot back. I'm trying to fix it, but I can't do it alone. Lorena paced the small apartment, her hands trembling. The cartel's everywhere, Carlos. They're probably watching me already. You showing up here? She stopped herself, shaking her head. I'll help you this once, but after this, you're on your own. Carlos nodded. I just need some food and supplies. Then we'll go. Lorena packed a small bag, her movements quick and efficient. You don't have much time, she said, glancing out the window. I've seen men hanging around here. It's only a matter of time before they come knocking. As Carlos took the bag, he met her gaze. Thank you, he said, the words strained but sincere. Lorena didn't respond. She simply opened the door and gestured for him to leave. Stay alive, she muttered as he stepped out into the night, Diego in tow. The brief moment of refuge had passed, and the chase was on again. Carlos's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the labyrinth of the city's outskirts. The bag Lorena had given him sat on the passenger seat, its contents a meager lifeline. In the back, Diego rested, his breathing steady but shallow, the inhaler having granted only temporary relief. Carlos's nerves were frayed, his mind haunted by the thought that every passing car, every shadowed corner, could hold the cartel's men. He took another detour, avoiding main roads and sticking to alleys and side streets. The old sedan rattled with each bump, its noises unnervingly loud in the quiet of the night. Diego stirred, his voice cutting through the tension. Where are we going now? Somewhere safe, Carlos replied curtly, though he wasn't sure where that would be. Safe didn't exist anymore, not for him, not for Diego. After what felt like hours of driving, Carlos spotted a dimly lit parking lot behind a closed convenience store. He pulled in and killed the engine, his instincts telling him to wait, to observe. The stillness felt unnatural, too perfect. His gut told him to move, but Diego needed rest, and Carlos needed a plan. Minutes ticked by. Carlos kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for movement. And then it happened. A single SUV pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Carlos's stomach dropped as more vehicles followed, surrounding the lot in a suffocating circle. They found us, Carlos muttered, his voice barely audible. Diego sat up, his eyes wide but calm. What are you going to do? Carlos reached for the knife tucked in his bag, the blade far too small to be comforting against automatic weapons. Stay down, he ordered, his voice hard. Don't move unless I tell you. The men stepped out of the SUVs, their figures silhouetted by the harsh lights. One of them called out, his voice cold and deliberate. Carlos, we know you're here. Hand over the boy and we'll make it quick. Carlos's grip tightened on the knife. He wasn't stupid. He knew this wasn't a negotiation. They didn't want the boy alive. They wanted to make an example of him. And Carlos, he was just collateral. Damn it, Carlos whispered to himself, glancing at Diego. The boy met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment there was a silent understanding between them. Carlos wasn't going to give up. He slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as he backed into one of the SUVs. The impact jolted the vehicle, but Carlos didn't stop. He spun the wheel and accelerated toward the exit, dodging gunfire as bullets pinged against the car's frame. A sharp turn brought them into a narrow alley, the sound of engines roaring behind them. Carlos pushed the old sedan to its limits, weaving through the tight streets until the headlights chasing them disappeared. Finally, he pulled into another dark corner and killed the engine, his chest heaving. Diego looked at him, his voice calm despite everything. You saved me again. Carlos didn't respond. The boy's words felt heavier than the silence that followed. Carlos paced the dimly lit hideout, a forgotten storage room in an abandoned industrial complex. The adrenaline from the ambush had worn off, leaving behind a gnawing exhaustion and the persistent weight of their predicament. Diego sat on a dusty crate, his pale face and labored breathing a stark reminder that their time was running out. The boy's inhaler had helped for a while, but it was clear that the attacks were getting worse. Carlos cursed under his breath. The supply Lorena had given them wasn't enough. He needed to find more medication, and soon. Diego broke the silence, his voice raspier than before. You don't have to do this. Carlos turned sharply. Don't start, kid. You could leave me somewhere, Diego continued, his tone oddly calm despite his frailty. Papa's men would find me. Carlos stared at him, anger flaring in his chest. Yeah, and they'd kill me the second they did. We've been over this. But deep down, he knew the boy wasn't wrong. Leaving him might draw the heat away from Carlos, but something inside wouldn't let him do it. Not after everything. He ran a hand through his hair, forcing his thoughts back to the immediate problem, the inhaler. The nearest pharmacy was a few miles away, but it was in cartel-controlled territory. Carlos knew it was suicide to go there, but Diego's worsening condition left him no choice. The boy had fallen silent again, his breath shallow and uneven. I'll be back, Carlos said, grabbing his knife and stuffing it into his jacket. He paused at the door, glancing at Diego. Stay here. Don't make a sound. Diego nodded weakly, and Carlos slipped into the night. The streets were eerily quiet as Carlos moved through the alleys, his every step measured and deliberate. The pharmacy was a small, nondescript building at the edge of the district. A single light flickered above the entrance. Carlos scanned the area, noting the black SUV parked nearby. His stomach twisted. Of course, he muttered. Alejandro's men were everywhere. Carlos waited, studying the guards. Two of them stood by the vehicle, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. A third leaned against the pharmacy's door, smoking a cigarette. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't easy either. Taking a deep breath, Carlos moved silently along the shadows, slipping behind the building. A side window was cracked open, just enough for him to pry it loose. He climbed through, landing in the dimly lit storeroom. The shelves were cluttered with supplies, and his eyes darted frantically across the labels until he found what he needed. An inhaler and a few more medications. The sound of voices outside froze him in place. The guards were talking, their footsteps echoing near the entrance. Carlos shoved the supplies into his bag and retraced his steps, slipping back out the window just as the door creaked open behind him. He didn't stop moving until he was blocks away, the stolen items clutched tightly against his chest. Only when he reached the hideout and saw Diego's weak smile as he handed over the inhaler, did Carlos feel the tension in his body ease. For a fleeting moment, the boy's breathing stabilized, and Carlos allowed himself a rare thought. Maybe they had a chance. Carlos drove through the pre-dawn darkness, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He had spent the past few hours running, but he knew it was pointless now. They were out of hiding spots, out of time. Diego sat silently in the passenger seat, his face pale but his breathing steady after using the new inhaler. Carlos's decision was clear. He couldn't keep this up. The only way out, the only chance for Diego's survival, was to face Alejandro directly. The thought churned his stomach, but the boy needed to be returned, even if it cost Carlos his life. As the first light of morning bled into the sky, Carlos pulled the car onto a dirt road leading to an expansive estate. High walls surrounded the property, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. The gate loomed ahead, an imposing barrier that signaled the end of the line. Carlos stopped the car, exhaling shakily. "This is it, kid," he said, looking at Diego. "Your old man's inside." Diego turned to him, his dark eyes studying Carlos. "You're not going to make it out, are you?" Carlos forced a smirk. "Probably not, but at least you will." The boy didn't respond, but something in his gaze softened, a flicker of emotion that Carlos couldn't place. With a deep breath, Carlos stepped out of the car, his hands raised above his head. Diego followed, standing slightly behind him. The guards reacted instantly, weapons drawn and aimed. Carlos felt the weight of their stares as one of them barked into a radio. Moments later, the gates groaned open.
They were escorted inside, through lush gardens and into the heart of the estate. The interior was lavish, a stark contrast to the gritty streets Carlos had been hiding in. At the center of the grand hall stood Alejandro Valverde, a man whose reputation preceded him. His presence was commanding, his sharp eyes locking onto Carlos with a cold intensity. Alejandro stepped forward, his gaze shifting briefly to Diego before returning to Carlos. "You have some nerve," he said, his voice low but brimming with menace. Carlos swallowed hard but didn't falter. "I didn't know who he was when I took him," he admitted. "I was desperate, but I kept him safe. I made sure nothing happened to him." Alejandro's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He turned to Diego, his voice softening slightly. "Are you hurt?" Diego shook his head. "I'm fine, Papa. He took care of me."
The boy's words hung in the air, surprising both Alejandro and Carlos. For a moment, Alejandro's cold exterior cracked, revealing a flicker of something human. He studied Carlos again, this time with less fury and more curiosity. "You expect me to believe this was an act of kindness?" Alejandro asked, his tone sharp. "No," Carlos replied honestly. "I just didn't want him to die, that's all." Alejandro's eyes narrowed. He motioned to his men, who grabbed Carlos roughly. The sharp sting of a gun barrel pressed into his back as they dragged him away. Carlos didn't resist. He had done what he came to do. As they led him out of the hall, Diego's voice cut through the tension. "Papa, wait." Alejandro paused, turning to his son. "He didn't have to protect me," Diego said, "but he did." For the first time, Alejandro hesitated. Carlos sat on his knees in the middle of the sprawling courtyard, his hands bound tightly behind him. Alejandro's men stood in a loose semicircle, their weapons at the ready. The early morning light cast long shadows, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Carlos stared at the ground, resigned to what was coming. Across the yard, Alejandro paced with measured steps, his cold gaze locked on Carlos. Diego stood at the edge of the scene, flanked by two guards. His eyes never left Carlos, and his expression was unreadable, a strange mix of fear and determination. "You know," Alejandro began, his voice calm but cutting, "I've made a career out of dealing with problems. People who cross me don't live long enough to regret it." Carlos didn't reply. He had no defense, no excuses left. His chest tightened as he braced for the inevitable. "But you," Alejandro continued, stopping just in front of him. "You've complicated things. My son says you protected him, that you risked your life for him." "I did," Carlos said quietly, lifting his head. "I know it doesn't change anything, but it's the truth." Alejandro's sharp eyes studied him, weighing the words. "And yet you took him, put him in danger." "I made a mistake," Carlos admitted. "But when I realized what I'd done, I tried to make it right." The cartel leader's expression remained unreadable as he took a step back. He gestured to one of his men. The sound of a gun being cocked sent a chill through the air, and Carlos felt the barrel press against the back of his head. "This is what happens to those who cross me," Alejandro said, his voice steady. Diego's voice broke the stillness. "Papa, stop." Alejandro turned, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't your concern, Diego." The boy stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "It is. He saved me. Twice. If he wanted to hurt me, he could have. But he didn't. He didn't even leave me when he had the chance." Alejandro hesitated, the weight of his son's words lingering in the air. His jaw tightened as he signaled for the man to lower the gun. The guard obeyed, but the tension didn't ease. "You think I should let him live?" Alejandro asked, his tone sharp. Diego nodded. "He earned it." Alejandro exhaled deeply, his gaze shifting back to Carlos. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble," he said, "but my son's alive because of you. For that, I'll spare your life." Carlos blinked, stunned, as the guard stepped back. Alejandro crouched to his level, his voice low and firm. "You're leaving this city, this country. If I see you again, there won't be a second chance." Carlos nodded, the words catching in his throat. "Understood." Alejandro stood and turned to his men. "Get him out of here." As they dragged Carlos away, Diego called out softly, "Thank you." For the first time in days, Carlos allowed himself a faint, fleeting smile. Carlos awoke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The faint scent of salt lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp sting of pain radiating from his side. He shifted slightly, grimacing as he took in his surroundings. A small, nondescript shack overlooked the ocean, its wooden walls worn by years of exposure to the elements. It was quiet here, far too quiet compared to the chaos he'd just escaped. He pushed himself up, wincing as his bandaged wounds protested. Alejandro's men had patched him up enough to survive, but the message was clear. He was alive because of a decision made on a whim. His reprieve was conditional, his future uncertain. Carlos stepped outside, the morning sun blinding at first. The endless expanse of ocean stretched before him, calm and indifferent. For the first time in days, he let himself breathe deeply, the weight of constant danger finally lifting, if only slightly. As he stood there, lost in thought, the memory of Diego's words echoed in his mind. "Thank you." The boy's unwavering calm, his resilience, and his ability to see past fear had left a mark on Carlos. In a way, Diego had saved him too, forced him to confront who he was and what he had done. Carlos turned his back on the ocean, stepping inside the shack. The duffel bag lay on a rickety table, stuffed with a few supplies Alejandro's men had thrown together. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over. He didn't know where he'd go or what he'd do, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going back to the life that had brought him here. For the first time in years, Carlos allowed himself to hope for a new path for redemption. For freedom, sometimes a life pushes us into impossible situations, where survival means confronting not just the danger around us, but the choices that brought us there. Carlos's journey was more than a fight against the odds. It was a test of his humanity and the power of redemption. Faced with impossible decisions, would you have risked everything to protect someone else? Or would fear have taken over? What would you have done in Carlos's shoes? Click the video on your screen now to continue exploring stories that challenge our sense of morality and push us towards self-discovery. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for more tales that make you question, what would I have done? See you in the next video.